going to be talking about today Hobbes Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes Leviathan, specifically the first part titled On Man. And so just before we get into this, to the text itself, this work is a very renowned and very popular work of political science, of political theory, and certainly a really seminal work. And you could accurately say that this begins the start of liberal political theory and of kind of individualism. All of these ideas in some way have their origin in the political sense in this work. So we can't express enough. This work is really important in the history of political philosophy, in the history of liberal philosophy in particular. And just kind of for what we're doing here in particular, I think we've read Kant, and we're going to see a lot of the origins of these ideas, kind of bare expressions of these ideas articulated by Hobbes. But one thing, just in kind of an opening here, that I think is good to keep in mind when reading this, is that Hobbes's arguments here are going to be formed more by what he thinks is impossible or by what he disagrees with, rather than a positive explication of a philosophy. So, for instance, Hobbes just immediately denies there are such things as incorporeal substances, right? So with like substances that aren't made of like a body, right? And he's an eliminative materialist, and we can maybe talk just a tad bit about that. But so if that's the case, Hobbes is going to deny the idea of an immaterial soul. He's going to deny that he thinks God is a body, which is going to cause some really immense problems in his theology later in the book. But you're going to see how his denials of various parts of scholastic metaphysics are going to start cascading into a totally new philosophy of his. And it is totalistic in a sense that a lot of people are very familiar with what really the last 4 chapters of this work, where he talks about the state of nature. There's a lot of famous remarks there. But in the early part, he's actually going to kind of explicate a kind of base philosophy. And so, just to talk about briefly his introduction, right? So in his introduction, he talks about how this is not really just a treatise on man and the state. I mean, that's its end primarily, but really he sees this work as kind of explicating an entirely new philosophy, which not only talks about the nature of man and the state, but also of perceptions, desires, religions, and also God. And so all of this is subservient. It will be kind of consummated in the philosophy of the state. And you get here talking about, and this is not a new idea, but Hobbes is going to use it, where he says the state is very similar to a human body. And so to talk about the principles which underlie the state is to first and foremost talk about the principles that underlie human nature. And to that end, Hobbes refers to the state, or the Leviathan, as an artificial man. And obviously, this book is written, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, for Charles II. I think it's particularly who he writes this to, because in his introduction or his preface, he talks about, this knowledge that he's writing down here is going to give a person the key to kind of deciphering human interactions and workings. And if it gives you the key, it's going to allow you to be a better ruler, right? And so he's going to say, well, if this is what is true about man, this is accordingly how they should be governed. So the ultimate end of this is about governance, right? And in the process, we're gonna talk a lot about. And in doing, he immediately points out that he's going to come into conflict with the pre-existing tradition of political philosophy of his time, which are the scholastics, who largely follow from Aristotle. He's going to make frequent reference to the theories of Aristotle and the scholastics as like ludicrous or foolish. And really, as we'll see, his ultimate line against these people is that they're just unintuitive, right? They're impractical. And a large portion of Hobbes' work is going to rely on a notion of common sense. And while he's not going to say the words common sense a lot, you can really tell that what underlies a thinker like Hobbes is an appeal to a notion of kind of common sense reasoning, where Hobbes, there's a right way to think about things and a wrong way to think about things. And the right way of thinking about things is according to these kind of standards of common reasoning. And this is a tradition which is going to be taken up by really almost all British philosophers, like coming after this, really with the exception of various, kind of British idealist traditions in the 19th and 20th century. You're going to see the idea of common sense realism or kind of common sense philosophy. It's going to be continued to people like David Hume or that's in Scotland, or people like Bertrand Russell in more modern times. They're all going to take cues from the idea that philosophy should really just be grounded in something that's just kind of intuitive. It's kind of commonsensical, whereas he doesn't. Kind of the tradition of the Aristotelians in mainland Europe is really going to be, kind of a philosophy that's more critical, and so what the Germans are going to pick up on, critical kind of Enlightenment philosophy in the continent, as opposed to Hobbes's philosophy, which is very English. So just some things to keep in mind as we go through here. We're going to really, the arguments that are going to be made are going to appeal to, well, this is just intuitive, or, well, this is just kind of commonsensical. And they're going to follow from negations rather than positive constructions of a kind of scientific reasoning. Now, doesn't mean we discount that, right? I'm not a fan of that type of reasoning, but it's good. I think it's good to set the stage. So those are my kind of opening thoughts, but go take it away, Charlie.
Yeah, I would only add that you've already mentioned he's speaking doubly in this text. He's talking to the great majority of people, the great majority of men, but also to sovereigns. So this is supposed to aid the sovereign in the governance of the majority of men, but it's also supposed to be an aid to society in thinking about men's relationships between each other and to the sovereign. And then as a liberal thinker, we're also interested in thinking about and reading in Hobbes, how he's maybe transforming this kind of social order that he's reflecting on. There's a way of reading Leviathan as a justification of sovereign power, as an apologetic for the king. And you already said yourself that he was writing this to King Charles at a time when there was a civil war going on in
Yeah.
England, and people were calling the very idea of monarchy into question.
Yeah. Maybe
So there,
actually like elaborate on that just for
well, maybe we can
posterity.
get there.
Okay,
Maybe
okay.
we can get there.
Yeah,
There's a significance there that
right.
Hobbes is writing at this moment of crisis, and it is in the moment of crisis that he's kind of reflecting on the whole enterprise of society, just as people are calling the social order of the king into question. So there is that aspect to his work which is apologetic in nature. But at the same time, by subjecting the social order to reason, as you say, right reason, the way he thinks one should reason about government, he betrays his own liberalism, and he betrays the liberal kernel active in the rebellion against the king. Right, Oliver Cromwell, the levelers, the Roundheads, the people, the parliamentarians fighting against the king during the English Civil War, do so on the basis of some of the things that Hobbes is talking about here. They're doing this on the basis of reasoning about the enterprise of government and society. Hobbes is doing this in very much the same way, while at the same time being apologetic for the king, and of course disavowing very explicitly that one could ever form a social order by rebellion. He says that later on in the text. But this is how we want to think about this. Maybe the double sense present throughout the text, how Hobbes gets to where he ends up, and then of course what the consequences are for the society that we live in. But yeah, I would just leave it at that, and hopefully that's enticing enough.
All right, yeah, cool. So the first thing, just to kind of go in with the progression of the text. First thing, the first, I think, 6 chapters or so, maybe 5 chapters, are largely largely consist of like a theory of perception and of thought. It's really sort of like a metaphysical primer for Hobbes. And while we're not going to go through his theory of the imagination, that's just not what we're particularly interested in. I do think there is value to looking at kind of the metaphysics of what's going on here, and more importantly, how thinking of how reconceiving the individual, because that's what Hobbes is doing here, is reconceiving the individual, how that's going to affect a political project. So, as a rejoinder, we're not trying to talk about the metaphysics of the Enlightenment, because there really is no such thing. As we point out, Kant has a dramatically different metaphysics than Hobbes. Right now, Kant's going to take up problems that Hobbes is going to deal with. So, in some sense, they are dealing with the same problems, but nevertheless, I think it could be instructive. And so, really, kind of in chapter 1, he is expounding a theory of sense and a theory of thought. And so he says, well, all human thoughts are reducible to perceptions of some kind, and any idea, accordingly, is formed from perception. So it can be traced back to a kind of origin, a sensory origin, as Hobbes is going to talk about. And these origins are not direct perceptions of objects, but they're indirect. Hobbes calls it fancy. And this argument for indirect perception is based upon the ability to recall various things in dreams or in the faculty of memory, or our ability to call certain images to mind via action. His example is like when you rub your eyes, you like call the image of light, right? Or something like this. Or if you blink various times, you might see black or you might see a spot. And so he says, well, if these qualities that we perceive were within objects themselves, then the images of them would be inseparable from these objects, i.e., we would not be able to conceive of the color red without directly interacting with a red thing. So, ergo, he concludes that when something is originally perceived, there is an original fancy, to use his words, that is generated, which is an image that's remembered by the human mind in some ways and can kind of be recalled. This is contrary to kind of the doctrine of Aristotle, where he's going to again, it's very polemical that he engages with Aristotelian theories of perceptions, which you might find in De Anima. He calls them nonsense. Now, I do feel the need to note that he addresses these positions incorrectly. And he insinuates that Aristotle's theory of perception involves things emitting some perceptible species or perceptible substance to you, to which the viewer or then perceives. And while this is technically correct, because Aristotle believes that objects actually, they act on the senses, which are potency for perception, there is a lot less of a gulf between Aristotle between an object and a perceiver, in the same way that there is for Hobbes. So for Aristotle, it's like you're directly perceiving an object through a medium, right? But the object A has like your senses are potency for perception, right? And then B, an object, also is, by virtue of being an object, it's an object of perception, right? So it exists in some sense for perception, right? So your senses exist for perception, the object exists also for perception, so it's perceptible in that way. And so the mind, therefore, is going to comprehend these objects directly, and there's no generation of an image. So what Aristotle will say is, essentially a thing will act upon your senses, and by acting upon your senses, you are actually apprehending the form, your intellect, through the kind of the aspects of the object that are coming into your senses. Your intellect is actually going to grasp the form of the thing, what it means to be for the thing. And this form, then, when your intellect has grasped it, it's recall. That's how you're able to recall things. You're able to recall the form. But what's really going to be at work here, and what's really, I think, of interest to the kind of liberal project, is Hobbes, coming from Descartes, there is an underlying assumption that there's a gap, that there's a gulf between a perceiver and what is perceived. And this is going to arise from Descartes' Meditations, where Descartes levies what you might call kind of the ultimate epistemic objection to epistemology. And he says very famously in his first meditation that everything that he sees around him could be the work of a demon deceiving him, right? So the idea that everything around you could just be a complete lie. And, it's not to say that nobody had really thought of that as a possibility. People had thought of the idea that, your senses could doubt you. But I think Descartes really is unique in the history of philosophy insofar as that just everything can be doubted by you. And in so doing, you can see it betrays the idea that there is the perceiver and then the world to be perceived. And there exists a gap between these two. And Descartes really struggles with overcoming this gap between the mind and then the perceptible world. And he's really not able to explain the interaction. But in scholastic theories, there's not such a distance, right? The people that Hobbes is engaging with, this is not really a problem for them, right? Because they would say that, well, the skepticism is unwarranted. The idea that, yeah, your senses could be wrong via optical illusion, that, could be deceptive. It doesn't mean that perception could be a lie. Like, there's no warrant for this kind of doubt. And this kind of doubt actually assumes away an alienation of an individual, a subject, and its environment. And Hegel and other people are going to talk later about, well, if there's a gap between an object and ourself and perception is just something generated, well, then perception is in one sense not real because it's not what really is. The objects are what really are. But also then perception must be real. It must be real and not real at the same time because perception is, right? So when we look at Hobbes, when he talks about fancy, right? He's saying that, well, the fancy is just an image constructed of your mind of the object. So it's not the object itself. So it's not real in that sense, right? You're not really comprehending the object, but the perception is there. The fancy is there. So it is real. And Hegel points out that this is just a bit of an interesting dilemma that they're caught in, that at one point perception must be real and not real at the same time. And he says, well, kind of the ultimate impetus for driving a wedge between that is that you assume that your mind is just something fundamentally different from the world around you. And I think this is very central to the development of a political project like Hobbes. And we're going to see that the idea in the state of nature, where it's kind of the individual, each individuals are kind of against all the other individuals, is that in such a theory of what a person is, how a person perceives, you can already see the origins of, all right, well, if you're fundamentally alienated from your environment, the only thing you can really be sure of, and this is what Descartes says, the only thing you can really be certain of is kind of your own thoughts, right? You have to retreat into your own mind. And the world then becomes a rather egocentric construction. It's no longer relational. Or it's only relational in the sense that you are the subject and the world is your object. And so you are acting on the world. Your mind is what is perceiving things, right? You are the perceiver. Things are being grasped by your consciousness, right? So really you get a kind of atomism that is going to emerge because all we have are these egos, right? Society is composed of various egos, and these egos are kind of the sole arbiter of what they're seeing and their relationship between the world. And it elevates the individual in a way that we might say is kind of hitherto unknown to philosophy in terms of individual experience. So, again, not comprehensive of what Hobbes talks about here, but just to explain a bit of the metaphysics of how, it's like, does the state of nature come out of nowhere? Why are we at war? It's like, well, it comes from the idea that you are alienated from your environment in some way that's just like you are above the environment because you are the one taking it in, right? And there's a gulf between you, the perceiver, and your environment. Right? For Hobbes, it's like you're not even really seeing the environment. You're just seeing your constructions of it. Everything that you see is mediated according to your consciousness construction of reality. And under such a theory, it's of no shock that we're going to have a highly individual-centered corresponding political theory. So those were some of my observations there.
No, I think that's really good. I think that's a very clear presentation. I would just say this then, in addition, what is the immediate consequence of all of this for Hobbes's political project? It's that Hobbes believes we need to be able to derive the natural laws by reason. We need to be able to arrive at them through conclusion, and we need to be able to get to the natural laws from everyday experience. And so that means we must first have an idea of how human beings experience the world. And for Hobbes, it's this. It's um, yeah, it's being able to human beings bumping up against the world again as kind of the outside world being an external object, human beings bumping up against the conditions of the world, and on that basis arriving in covenant with one another, and concluding the lex naturalis, the natural law, um, which is then really what holds the social order together, which grounds the social order. And so this is why Hobbes is doing all this. This is why he's spending so much time talking about imagination and how human beings think and all this. Of course, the double sense here is also that um, the sovereign must concern himself with that which is common to mankind in order to be able to govern mankind. And so this kind of anthropology of man, this exposition of how men think and interact with the world is also supposed to guide the sovereign in understanding his subjects. So that is again his service that he's in a sense rendering to the king. But really, it's about how do we arrive at natural laws, and I suppose that'll also be once we get to it, his disagreement with the scholastics and maybe with the mainstream of academia, which is that he does not think that they provide either a good account or an account at all of how we arrive at the natural laws. Um, this is something he puts much more concretely, I think, in chapter 15, which we'll hopefully address next.
Yeah. Speaking of though, maybe something else to note is when you talk about the Hobbes' disagreement with the academics of his time, it's very prevalent in this work for Hobbes to engage very polemically with who he calls the schoolmen or the current academics. And the schoolmen are predominantly in the school of scholasticism. So that's going to be in the thought of people like Thomas Aquinas, and Thomas is going to follow a lot from Aristotle and kind of the medieval commentators on Aristotle. But that's the dominant academic tradition with which he is engaging in. Um, as like a historical note, I guess, not to character assassinate Hobbes, but I noted in the introduction to this work, it talks about like Hobbes really, his father was heavily anti-intellectual, and B, Hobbes did not he did not appreciate the years of his schooling very much in having to learn kind of scholastic philosophy, and it shows, I think, in some sense. But I guess my one of the question maybe we can just talk about pretty briefly is like what's the value of engaging like really polemically with kind of the schoolmen? Like what's the impetus behind that?
Yeah, I think this might also um, this might give us a cause to talk a little bit more about what's happening during this time period. Um, he's also polemical towards people who maybe exploit religion, or the clerics who pretty clearly, according to him, use religion to their own ends, um, as opposed to the actual ends, I suppose, to glorify God or what have you. And this, of course, again, is very much bound up with the bishops' wars and concerns over religion during this time, and really the concerns around religion, uh, characteristic of bourgeois society, the Enlightenment, and the Age of Revolution, which is to kind of close a different gulf of separation, namely the gulf separating the common folk, the laity, and the clergy. Um, and so Hobbes he is very polemical, perhaps unnecessarily so, but he is polemical against the gulf of separation between the scholastics, academia, and laity as such. It's the same for him in the realm of the academic as it is in the religious realm. Because again, according to Hobbes later on, the academics, and maybe I'll just launch into this quote, the academics will talk of many of the same virtues and passions that Hobbes is concerning himself with here. But according to Hobbes, they don't see why people praise the virtues. They don't actually understand the importance of them. And so I'll just read out this quote. I think it's very instructive. Quote, and I think this is in chapter 16. Quote, but the writers of moral philosophy, though they acknowledge the same virtues and vices, yet not seeing wherein consisted their goodness, nor that they come to be praised as the means of peaceable, sociable, and comfortable living, place them in a mediocrity of passions, as if not the cause, but the degree of daring made fortitude, or not the cause, but the quantity of a gift made liberality, unquote. And so these things which according to Hobbes are natural laws, among them justice, virtue, gratitude, mutual accommodation, and these kinds of things, their goodness lies in the fact that they are what make the social order possible. And that is what's near and dear to everyday people. And he spends a lot of time arguing about this as well, that it is in humans' interest to maybe forego certain liberties, certain aspects of their natural right, which is not the same as their natural law, in order to be in covenant with one another, in order to be in the social order. And according to Hobbes, this is what the academics, the schoolboys, the schoolmen fail to really apprehend. And this is bourgeois through and through. This is liberal, right? I think this is a liberal impulse, a liberal insight, that at the end of the day, it is about society and about what that means and existing in society. And how the virtues are actually concluded from this desire, this need, really, to be in covenant with one another. And that deduction is made through experience, through experiencing war and strife and coming to the conclusion that we might be better off in society. That's probably
Yeah,
not it's paraphrasing at that point, but
yeah.
trying to condense it a little bit.
No, I think that's a really good point. Insofar as that if you go back to kind of Plato and Aristotle, and Hobbes will kind of gloss over this when he treats what he calls the intellectual virtues. The idea of contemplation of like divine ideas is a really central theme where yes, Plato and Aristotle are concerned with practical objects of things. And this is, maybe where Hobbes, we might say, is really unnecessarily polemic, is that if you go in the works of Aristotle in the ethics and in the politics, it makes it quite clear he is concerned with the idea of a just society, or the idea of just interrelations with people. But at the same time, you could say there's a competing notion that Aristotle talks about, the business that's proper to philosophers, which is why Aristotle particularly thinks they can't be wrapped up in the state, is that, well, they need to be able to kind of be aloof to contemplate, right? To just think about the divine. And this is something that Hobbes would really obviously object to as like just ludicrously impractical or aloof, because this is where you again get another impulse. The smart people should be running society, right? The people that are knowledgeable, they should be running society. And in kind of the Catholic tradition, the smartest people are in the monasteries, right? Or in the ivory tower, as we might say. And so they're aloof and they're making all these theories and they're doing philosophy for philosophy as philosophy. And they're not engaging with the politics. And maybe in some sense, just to touch more on the historical time of this, is that in the late 1500s, right, you have a lot of division in the Church of England. You have the Oxford martyrs, Cranmer, Ridley, and Latimer, I believe, who are executed by Queen Mary. There are 3 bishops in the Church of England. And these were academics, right? These guys, these bishops, they were academics, and they were trying to bring about a kind of reformation in England. All three of these guys were executed because of their attempts to reform the Church of England. So in that sense, people like Hobbes are going to identify these guys as kind of the bad guys of what gets the English Revolution going. Where, look, these clerics, right? These clerics, they were so concerned with kind of their religious philosophy and trying to all these terms like quiddity and all this stuff. They did not think to see that they were creating the conditions for a brutal civil war. And that's what Hobbes is first coming out of when he's writing this, is that King Charles is hiding in France, or King Charles II, I should say, is in France. King Charles I is beheaded, right? Cromwell is ruling England. And you brought up the point of he makes fun of people or engages people harshly who use religion to kind of meet their own ends. Is that for a while in England, the government of Cromwell and the government prior to him assuming the title of Lord Protector is largely Presbyterian. And Cromwell is a person that will often invoke the idea of divine providence in his rule, and was probably a very convicted person when it came to seeing his rule of England as an element of providence, right? Even seeing, kind of the king as a demonic force when he's compromising with kind of Catholicism, right? Hobbes actually takes this idea up where he talks about the idea of demons is like nonsense, right? There are no demons, because he doesn't believe in spiritual substances, right? But there are no demons. There are just people who are manipulating religion to their ends. And Hobbes would undoubtedly accuse someone of Cromwell like this, even though, as you say, they actually might agree on a whole lot. It doesn't matter. For Hobbes, this undermined the state. This created a civil war. This created strife. It undermined commerce. It undermined the rule of law, right? The Levelers, which is the more radical faction of the English Civil War, they wanted like land seizure by the government. They wanted to seize the land of the nobility to redistribute it, right? And they wanted a more equitable distribution of land and goods across England. I mean, eventually they were purged by Cromwell, who actually didn't favor such a distribution. But these people were for a time a part of the governing coalition of the revolution. So I think, yeah, Hobbes is going to point to maybe academics or high flying pious religious philosophy as a cause of the kind of 60 years of very brutal fighting that you're going to have going on in England at the time. All right, so the next couple things we want to briefly talk about is I think one, passion. Hobbes going to talk about passions as kind of the origins of voluntary behavior, and he conceives of passions very mechanistically, in the sense that really it's a series of desires, right? And he talks about the final desire or the final appetite in like a chain of desire is going to be like your deliberative faculty. So again, it's very much when you want to do something, you're going to experience a set of desires to do this thing and a set of passions. And based upon your deliberation, you're going to do it or not, right? So, but I think what's interesting here, right, is that so he has this section where he says, referring to the terms good and evil, he calls good and evil actually passions. He lives in passions. And he says, there is nothing, the terms good and evil do not refer to anything simply and absolutely so, and that no common rule of good and evil can be found within objects, right? So there's no object which we can actually call good or evil. There's just simply our feeling about whether it's good or evil, depending upon how we feel about it, basically. If we have an aversion to it, we call it evil. If we have a desire for it, we call it good. And this is, again, kind of very endemic of the idea. Hobbes is going to assert that since there are no incorporeal substances, you're going to have an object to things, right? Feelings about things are going to require some object to which they are about, otherwise they're nonsense. And he kind of addressed that in his categories of language. But I think what's interesting is, one, there's this idea of, and then he says, like, right after this is a corollary, like in a commonwealth, what's good or evil is just decided by the state. And I don't take that as like him saying, like giving his take on moral philosophy, but it is a break from the tradition of the scholastics, who are going to talk about concepts like good, and they identify good with being, right? So an object actually, according to how much being it has goodness, right? So a thing that has more being has more goodness. Of course, he denies these kinds of things. And accordingly, when he talks about the the passions and their objects, he's going to go through several of them, and he talks about fear and hope. But there are also passions on here that I wanted to get your take on, where she talks about courage, benevolence, magnanimity, and these are what would previously be considered actually virtues under Aristotle. All three of those are three of the 12 virtues that Aristotle talks about in the Ethics. And specifically in the Ethics and in scholastic philosophy, the virtues are something that are actually highly rational. Uh, so Aristotle's going to talk about you need virtues are finding the mean, the golden mean of a given action, of like what to do in a given situation, and to find, because you don't have a disposition to virtue or vice. So in order to find what the right amount of courage to have in a given scenario is going to require the use of your reason. So to be virtuous is essentially to be rational. And Aquinas is going to formalize this distinction later when he just immediately says the good is the rational, right? What is right is what is rational. But for Hobbes, this is immediately blown up, right? And he's going to say, it's nonsense. And actually, these things that are previously considered virtues, well, they're actually just kind of desires, right? Or they're derivative of desires in some way. They're a kind of desire. They're a kind of appetite, right? Because they have an object, and because they have to have an object. And so I think it's rather interesting that for Aristotle, these things are essentially parts of character, right? They're character traits. They form a person's who they are. But for Hobbes, it's not really the case. It doesn't seem like that's the case, right? It seems like really anybody could have these things. Anybody could feel this way. And he talks about that with just or unjust. Talks about like the just man is a person who all of his actions, or he tries to make sure all of his actions are just, even though you can be considered just if you do something that is just. For Aristotle, it's like, no, justice is like a habit, right? It's a virtue. But I think more fundamentally, whereas in scholastic philosophy, these things are part of kind of your essence, right? Your who you are, your character. For Hobbes, they're much more to the level of desire. And I think as we go through this goes back to, again, you are kind of the one feeling all of these things. But I am curious to know, like, what is the significance, right? Obviously, this is a really big break to the time of Hobbes. But what is kind of the significance of taking desire, or taking these virtues and kind of putting them on the levels of desires or appetites, rather than in previous philosophy they were very rational?
Okay. So you've already commented on the mechanistic aspect here, which is that for Hobbes, the passions are just motions. An appetite is toward an object, an aversion is from an object. Love is a kind of appetite, hate is an aversion. Good is an appetite, bad, evil is an aversion. And so there's an interesting contrast here where, on the one hand, to suggest that virtue is something essential to humans or to individuals, part of their essence, would be to suggest that one could be virtuous in the absence of society, that we could be virtuous outside of society if we are, in our essence, in our soul, virtuous in whatever respect. Whereas for Hobbes, it seems pretty clear that right and wrong, justice, injustice, these things only attain meaning in society. They only actually attain meaning in the commonwealth. But at the same time, they don't just pop into existence as soon as we enter into society, right? They derive from motions, the passions, which are essentially innate. So we have these motions, these appetites and these aversions, which compel us towards an object. And we might say that for Hobbes, what is virtuous, those passions are virtuous, or virtues themselves being passions, are virtuous by virtue, by fact of compelling us to enter into society. We have an appetite for, I guess, living a longer life. This is one of the things he says of the brutish state of nature, the state of war, as he puts it, right? Is that life is short. We have an aversion, a kind of a motion fromward, these kinds of conditions in the state of nature, in the state of war, right? We have an appetite for the opposite of the state of war. And it is this which puts us into covenant with each other, kind of social contract theory. And it is this way that we end up in society. And so perhaps virtuous is, for Hobbes, whatever puts us in this place of society. And of course, this is in fact the case because for Hobbes, justice is whatever keeps the covenant, right? The covenant with God, the
Right.
covenant with each other, and injustice is whatever breaks the covenant. And so an injustice would be a separation from society, from the social covenant, right? And so can we call an unjust person virtuous? Well, perhaps in certain other respects, but if he is unjust, he has broken the covenant and he has removed himself from society, versus he who is just is in society because he has kept the covenant. And so for Hobbes, I think what this is supposed to spell out, and maybe we can argue about whether or not it actually does, but what it's supposed to spell out is that we actually get from these motions, these passions, to society. How do we bridge that gap? Now, to be clear, on the one hand, the gap is between the state of nature and the commonwealth. But Hobbes is very clear, and I guess now we've moved on to this point, this part of the conversation, state of nature. Hobbes makes it very clear that he does not think there ever was a general state of nature, right? He's not making a historical argument saying that at one point in time, this was what
The base,
everything was
right?
like, what the whole world looked like, right? But there is still a gap, and there's always perhaps a possibility of ending up in a state of nature. And so
Yeah,
it's
I
about,
was gonna say that where it's a thought experiment because the ultimate end of
it
the state of
is,
nature
yeah,
is to demonstrate the laws of nature, and then he's gonna eventually have his reductio where it's like, okay, to enforce these laws, you need a state, right? These laws, their culmination is the state, the Leviathan, right? But there does seem a constant and real possibility that although the state of nature is not necessarily maybe the way things went, that it could be a thing that happened, right? It could be a state which is actually attainable, that while it's hypothetical in the work of Leviathan, it doesn't need to exist only in Leviathan. We might say whether Hobbes speculated about kind of the state of war in his country, or maybe you could say maybe Ireland in a state of war. There was a lot of brutal fighting in Ireland at the time. So these ideas of a state of nature seem to have an actual state in mind, although in the work he is not making, as you say, there's not a kind of phylogenetic argument of this is how things proceeded. But yeah, I guess
yeah, I can pick it up from there as well. Um, it's to say that what's at stake at every moment in society is society itself.
right.
We are always at risk of being launched into a state of
Yeah.
nature. And this is
There's entropy and we are trying to avoid it, right?
basically, right, it's the state of nature is the sword of Damocles over us at every moment. And I guess the person who is at once holding the sword of Damocles is also the person who can let it drop, and that is the sovereign. The sovereign is kind of the glue that holds it together. And
Right.
absent the sovereign, this sword falls on us and again puts us in this horrible state of war, state of nature. Um, but we have the state. So if we conceive the state of nature that Hobbes is talking about, again, as a hypothetical, it is a state of affairs in which liberty is maximal. And of course, Hobbes defines liberty as the absence of external impediments to man's power to do what he
Right.
would. Absolute liberty is do as thou wilt, that man can do whatever he wants,
Yeah, it's a
right?
physical condition rather than a statement of fulfilling a nature or something.
Yes. Um, and but as Hobbes says, this is a very brutish and nasty kind of state of existence that we want to avoid, right? It's not so much that we're trying to escape it, but we are trying to avoid it, right? We've
Right.
not crawled our way out of the state of nature necessarily, although he seems to suggest that this is the case for tribal populations in the Americas, that live in a quasi state of nature. But we are trying to avoid it. And so because of this, we arrive at a fundamental law. The fundamental natural law is to seek peace and follow it. And the other aspect, the other part of the fundamental law is to defend ourselves by any means. Now, to seek peace and to follow it is again the lex naturalis, whereas to defend ourselves by any means is the jus naturalis,
The
the
right of
natural
nature.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
as opposed to the natural law.
Yeah. Well, like,
Um,
okay. So let's reflect for a moment on kind of the conditions of the state of nature, like how he sets this up, because I think it's very interesting in the second section of chapter 13, right? Where he talks about, people are willing to admit that people are that others to be more witty or more eloquent or more learned, yet they will hardly believe there be many so wise as themselves. And then he says, for there is not ordinarily a greater sign of the equal distribution of anything than that every man is contented with his share. And he said this proves that rather that men are in that point equal rather than unequal. Um, and so he says, well, from this equality, basically the equality, um, that I take it is that everyone thinks that like they're the smartest, or in some sense. And from this, he says, arises diffidence, right? So he starts out in this, I guess, assuming very little, where he's like, okay, well, everyone thinks that they're pretty smart, right? They're willing to admit that people are funnier and that people can talk better, but they're not willing to admit that people are smarter than them, right? And it says, for when they see their own wit at hand and another, they see their own wit at hand and other men's at a distance. Um, so yeah, let's. It's interesting that he makes it. I thought it was very interesting, this point of this difference arises actually from a fundamental state of equality in the state of nature. That in the state of nature, actually people are pretty equal. That there might be endowments of eloquence or wit or talent, but I was questioning. What is people will admit that other people are more witty or more learned, but what does that mean when they won't admit people are more, or people are not as wise as they are? And that's the equality. So what's your take on that? I wasn't too sure, honestly.
so I think when he's talking about, I guess you said wise, what he's talking about is prudence. Um, and this is based, according to Hobbes, it's based on experience. Um, every man, every human figures himself smarter than everyone else on account of his own experiences.
Right.
And so the consequence that Hobbes spells out here is that competition is only possible on the basis of this kind of equality, right? If there really was someone much wiser, more capable than everyone else, how could we hope to compete with that person? It would seem to suggest that there couldn't be any competition. Now, of course, perhaps there are people like that that can outsmart others and hence maybe, compete better. But the fact is that we are capable of entering into competition with one another. And that supposes a kind of inequality, or sorry, a kind of equality, that um, we take our prudence and we figure ourselves prudent enough to compete with others for the same ends. Um,
Yeah. Well,
but
I
this
think this
competition
is,
leads to war. It
yeah,
leads to the state of war,
yeah,
which then, of course, uh, forces us to draw new conclusions.
right. I think an interesting thing that he says later, right, is in previous political theory, that of Aristotle, right? Aristotle in book 1 of Politics talks about the subject that all undergraduates vomit at when they see, which is talks about some people are naturally suited to like being ruled or being enslaved, right? He talks about people that are natural slaves. And Hobbes thinks this notion is silly because he misunderstands what Aristotle means. But he says the notion is silly because nobody likes to be ruled over, because everyone thinks that they could be a better ruler for themselves, right? And Aristotle's of course not talking about whether people think they can be ruled. He just as a statement of what they are, right? That they're more fit to be ruled over than to be rulers. But I think this is a really crucial assumption where it's like we're starting off from a position of equality, right? A previous political philosophy started off from a position of inequality, from the fact that there are more just people, there are just better people, right? That's Plato's whole thing, is that in Republic he advocates for a primarily a society that practices eugenics precisely because like the people who are like auxiliaries could never be the guardians, right? They could never be the kings. So some people are just naturally more fit. But for Hobbes, he says, at least in our own minds, right? Nobody's willing to admit that, right? Nobody's willing to say that in it. And I think in some way, the force of this construction actually really does depend on whether Hobbes is, in a sense, correct, right? I mean, this is a kind of hypothesis in some sense. So I think it really, it does depend on a notion of equality, which is going to be very essential. And this intuition is going to be, I think, essential for the development of uh, political theory post Hobbes, right? Because obviously you're going to have reactions to this that are negative, reactions to this that are positive. They're going to equate some kind of fundamental equality, right? Not on the same basis as Hobbes, but Hobbes is really big here in saying that political society only arises because, well, in the state of nature, and it must be true in some sense, that people are able to compete with one another, right? And our competition is what brings us to the same level, to the state of war. And the state of war is essentially a state of ultimate equality, where nobody is like, right? That's why you have to, he talks about later, you have to renounce your right. Hobbes allows for no idea that simply one group is more powerful than another, right? And just conquers. There's no conquest theory. It's no, in a real sense, rights have to be given up. And that's not necessarily a voluntary process, but you could think of a political theory where, well, just one person in the state of nature just wins out. No, Hobbes is saying no, the right of nature has to be renounced by people. And then in the state, that just looks like people don't exercise their right to kill you whenever they want, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's really central to note that this starts out from a basis of equality.
Yeah. There
Novel.
he puts this equality in another way as well, which is that he puts it in an almost socialistic way, which is that in the state of nature, everyone governed by their own reason has right to everyone and everything. So there's a notion of radical mutual possession that I have almost a right to you and everyone else in the state of nature, which also means that I could just kill you at any moment because it's not right or wrong, it's not just or unjust, because these things only mean anything in a covenant with one another. And so this covenant, by entering into the covenant, I renounce simultaneously this radical right to possession of everyone. This is what's being given up. But maybe let's try to spell out a little bit more how Hobbes actually makes this deduction, how the law of nature is deduced from this. So again, going back, what is the law of nature? He puts it this way: it's a general rule found out by reason that forbids man from doing that which is destructive of his life. And that is very important. That is very important
It's very
because,
individualistic.
yes, it is individualistic, but it's also it's a paradox almost, because for Hobbes, it is this which puts us into society. Destructive of his life, such as doing what would remove us from the social order. Anything that removes us from the social order, anything that we do which risks extricating us from society, puts us into the state of war, into the state of nature. And for Hobbes, this is fundamentally destructive to our lives. For one, he says that it in the state of nature we are not inclined to industry and art and culture and these kinds of things. We are inclined to just radical self-preservation.
And
And it
there's
is
no
a nasty,
justice, right?
there's no justice. So
Yeah.
anyone can kill us. It's a very, very brutish existence. And so perhaps this is how he justifies then any number of laws which are then established in society, which is that a man who breaks a law that would remove him from society is breaking the natural law because he's fundamentally acting against his own interest. You are acting in your own interest by violating the rules of society because thereby you are removing yourself from society. And what does that lead to? It leads to the state of nature, at the very least for yourself. And this is not a place you want to be in. And this seems to be most significant. This is the deduction that he makes. He says at another point, quote, he that breaketh his covenant, such as with confederates in a state of war. So he's talking about, if we're in conflict in the state of nature, state of war,
Right.
we make a covenant with our confederates, our friends.
Yeah.
He that breaketh his covenant and consequently declareth that he thinks he may with reason do so, cannot be received into any society that unite themselves of peace and defense, but by the error of them that receive him. So hopefully I wrote that correctly, somewhat dyslexic. But when I
Yeah.
wrote down this quote, he's saying that you cannot, by reason, remove yourself from society.
Yeah. Because this you bring up, this is addressed to the objection by who Hobbes calls the fool, right? And the fool basically denies justice and says, no, you should just do whatever you think is best for you, right? Which you might say if, right, I don't mean to draw it back in, but if Descartes brings in the ultimate skepticism in metaphysics, Hobbes brings in the fool, who is just the person that says I should just do whatever I want, right? Who cares? And he's not the first to do this. You could say Callicles also says this in Plato's dialogue Georges. But Hobbes, obviously Hobbes sets this up as the idea of this is a rational state, right? And it's rational for you to renounce your right of nature, right? To enter into society. The fool is just trying to say, well, no, it's not. The state of nature is preferable, right? Or at least, if not the state of nature, the state where you decide what is best for you, which we might term egoism now. So Hobbes, your example, Hobbes says, okay, well, if you can just, renounce your covenants or break your covenants or whatever, you're antisocial. And
Yes.
I thought this was
Yeah.
very interesting, and I have a notation here where um, there's this notion that I think develops of politics as a kind of team sport, right? Where it's like, right, the person that's with his Confederates, with his, his body politic, he needs to be able to keep his promises because we're all on the same team here, buddy, right? And if if you start saying that there's an I in team, we're going to kick you out, right? And you're not going to be able to get the benefits from society. But I think this is very, very interesting notion of of political organization, where it's like, well, like to be part of the body politic, to be a part of society is to reap its benefits, to be free from having to constantly be assailed by the war of nature. And so from this, there really is the idea that people that are in a society, Hobbes thinks, should think as if they're all on the same team, right? That
Mm-hmm.
it's like, okay, well, we have to preserve society. At the end of the day, um, we cannot let this society struggle. And you maybe say is a kind of veiled critique of factionalism. That's what I kind of took it as, right? Um, where it's like Hobbes would probably address this to political parties which try to kind of backstab each other. And that's why Hobbes is eventually going to endorse a system of absolutism, right? So that there are no factions. But in the side of the English Civil War in particular, there are a wide variety of factions, right? And there are factions within factions or sub-factions, etc., right? And they're all betraying each other, right? The levelers are betraying Cromwell. Cromwell's betraying the levelers. He's purging the parliaments, just back and forth, saying, well, if we do this, right, then there's what he says. He's like, He can't expect no other means of safety than what can be had from his own power. If you do that, if you break your promises, you are subjecting yourself to the state of nature again. You're subjecting yourself to social entropy, right? Which is what must be avoided.
Yeah, it is not in man's interest, nor is it reasonable to break the covenant. Another quote, if he be left or cast out of society, he perisheth, unquote. So man would be violating the fundamental natural law to not destroy himself, right? Another example to maybe bring this home, and I thought it was a very good example. Quote, the fool hath said in his heart, there is no such thing as justice, unquote. Of course, very consciously, I think, mimicking Psalm 14:1, the fool hath said in his heart that there is no God. And so the example he gives here is someone who might venture to argue, if the kingdom of God is attainable through unjust violence, we are excused of this unjust violence by attaining it, right? Because we are justified by virtue of being in the kingdom of God.
The
So another
ends
way to say this
justify
would
the means, right?
basically,
That's what that
right?
is.
The fool would say that the ends justify the means. The fool here is the utilitarian, right? Which is another way of saying this would be then, if we can be in a society, right? If we can attain to a social order through injustice, what does it matter? Because we've managed to end up in society and this makes it just. Again, the ends justifying the means. But Hobbes rejects this, right? In the example of the kingdom of God is only attained by keeping the covenant and so cannot be attained unjustly. However, of course, from such reasoning as this, successful wickedness hath obtained the name of virtue, unquote. A not so veiled attack against the revolutionaries in the English Civil War, perhaps. I think so. I think probably. But the important part here is just that um, we do not attain the kingdom of God. We do not attain to society through injustice, only through covenant. And if we try to pursue it unjustly, right, this is nonsensical.
Yeah.
This is frivolous, as he says, because it can only be attained through covenant, and it is the breaking of the covenant which separates us from the kingdom of God and from society.
Yeah.
It is the breaking of the covenant which sends us into the state of nature where we perish.
Yeah. Right. So briefly, I think you touch on a very good issue here, which is that namely his conception of justice. Just for reference, there are 19 of the laws of nature which Hobbes deduces, and I don't think discussing the individual ones is as important, really, because we know their ultimate culmination is okay. Well, to enforce these laws, we need the state, right? We need a state. But I think a very interesting and distinctively liberal conception of justice arises here, which is namely that justice is contractual, it's private in some sense, right? It regulates agreements between people, right? Whether it's a covenant between God or between man and another man or between man and society. And this is an issue that is that's rearing its head today. Namely, there are competing notions of what justice should address, right? Which is we can think of in previous times, because again, he's addressing this to the schoolmen, or he's trying to refute the schoolmen. In ancient Greek society, notions of justice, for Plato, justice was what a person is due. So something is just when, or something is a justly attained when you earned it, right? And Hobbes says, no, you can only merit something when you have a right to it, right? When you have a contractual right to it. So in some sense, ancient theories of justice are distributive theories of justice. They're interested in what is the just distribution of social goods, right? Because again, in Plato and Aristotle, you're going to assume that everything society attains to belongs to society. Everything, right? Your family's manor, right? And in Greeks, like your family's property is not even owned by you. It's owned by your household, by your oikos, and your oikos transcends you, right? And your oikos is only possible because you live in your city state, right? So really, the state has ultimate say over the just distribution of goods. And your family's manor is allowed to subsist because your family has attained honor, right? It's what is due to your family. But for Hobbes, justice is not concerned at all with what is a just distribution of goods or distributing social goods at all, right? Because it's concerned with a relation between people based upon a kind of contract that they have, right? And I thought this is very interesting that I kind of refer to it as the privatization of justice, where we're going to have a fundamentally different idea of what justice should address. It's no longer going to address what a person is due in terms of material goods, because, well, for Hobbes, a person is going to largely be able to determine for themselves how to do this. And in his discussion of power, which I thought was very interesting, he talks about the worth of a person is the price to be paid for how much power they can command. So one, I suppose, the low-hanging fruit is he quantifies the worth of a person in like literally monetary value. But also, there's the notion of you can actually improve like what you are worth. You, via the acquisition of a political office or by the acquisition of more goods in trade, you can actually determine what honor is becoming of you. Whereas in ancient society, right, your honor is solely based upon what you're due, and what you're due is dependent upon what role you are in the community, right? So the magistrate is due his honor because he is a magistrate, because he performs his function to the community. Everybody has a function, right? For Hobbes, there's no talk of this functionality whatsoever, right? It's you can determine for yourself, oh, I've made money, ergo you should honor me more. And this justice, right? These notions of justice are only going to govern relations. They're not going to govern how the goods of society should be distributed, because in the state of nature, it's theoretically possible that you could acquire an infinite amount of monetary goods, right, or something like this, right, or you could acquire a lot of it for yourself. Society is not determining your ability to actually acquire things, right? Society is determining your ability to literally live, right, or to live meaningfully, maybe. But I think that's a very interesting turn that we're going to undergo here, where justice is taken from, in a sense, public to private, right? And maybe what we're grasping at is that whereas in ancient theories of justice, it was just sort of assumed that the resources of every member of the community fundamentally belonged to the community. There was no sense of ownership, right? It's like that you owned this, right? For Hobbes, there is, right? And that's maybe what we see is promoting the virtues of the marketplace, right? The virtues of acquisition, right? Being industrious, being able to acquire, etc. So I know there's
No,
I know that's a
that's
thing, but go ahead.
I would just wrap it up by saying that Hobbes is overflowing with bourgeois right here. The way he talks about the value that we can attain through our own activity in society, and that, as you very aptly put it, this view of society as a team sport, a covenant that we enter into with each other, right? As kind of the early conception of a social contract theory. This is liberal through and through. It's bourgeois through and through. And perhaps it is so in ways that Hobbes himself didn't exactly realize at this time, when ostensibly the people he was writing for were was the monarchy, and the people that he was writing against were the bourgeois rebels, the Puritans, and the revolutionaries. But it is all these ideas which ultimately culminate in revolution and social transformation. So that I would just leave it at
Yeah.
that for myself.
Yeah, no, it's good. I think, ultimately, if like Hobbes says, if we take Hobbes at his word, where our idea of the individual is going to inform our idea of the state, we're going to start to see, right, how this is going to offer up a very radically different kind of state. Maybe much different than Hobbes himself even identifies, right? It's that the principles of now, right, honor or worth is something that you can determine. It's not a role, right? And the idea of society is it's like a kind of collective. It's a banding together of people, right? Society is actually formed by the individual, right? Whereas in previous things, you might say that the individual is formed by society. Society must be prior to the individual. No, right? Society is a product of our collective efforts. It's a team sport. And within society, you can determine for yourself a place. You can carve a domain in society, insofar as that you give up your natural right to kill people or whatever. But yeah, I think if we take what Hobbes is saying that this work is trying to do, at face value, what he is himself saying, this is a very liberal, as you say, this is overflowing with bourgeois and liberal sentiment. And for reference, we don't use that as a slang word or as a pejorative, right? Just as a statement of fact, where this is the origin of, all right, well, the state needs to protect property, right? Or eventually that's we're going to get in lock, or needs to protect the ability of people to be industrious, right? So Hobbes himself is not going to say these things, but as people progress and as these ideas are kind of internalized within the society Hobbes is writing to, as you say, it's like he's going to be sympathizing a lot more with these kind of rebels than he might have himself intended. And so as we continue to read through this corresponding idea of the state, I think it's very central to keep in mind wherever we've started from. So I hope we've presented an interesting account of that thus far. But yeah, that's all I've got. Anything else to add? All right, awesome.